Hey everyone, Happy New Year! My guest today on Creative Inspired Happy is Heather Demetrios, a critically acclaimed novelist and writing coach who specializes in guiding writers in bringing their ideas to their full potential, mindfulness, mental health and creative practices, and more. Today, we talk about the differences between a writing coach and a freelance editor, health practices that support your writing, how to balance writing what's true to your heart and those stories that sell, tips for getting over the fear or self-doubt at the start of a project, and so much more. Creative Inspired Happy is a video podcast about incredibly successful writers and how they rose out of obscurity to build fulfilling careers. To join our community and get more writing advice, creativity challenges, and more, follow the link in the episode notes. I hope you enjoy the show. Hey, Heather, welcome to Creative Inspired Happy.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here.
I am thrilled to finally meet you because I've heard so much about you. My very dear friend, Dana Elmendorf, who is now a very well-published author, she credits you with helping to revive her career. She'd been published once back in 2016 and then gone years without feeling like she could tap into herself and write something good again. And then she met you and you helped her work through it. And then she went to auction with a book and then she published with a Big Five last year. And she was on Good Morning America. Her book was like in Times Square on the GMA billboard. So you're amazing. I can't wait to dig into what you do.
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, she is amazing. I will take a little bit of credit in that I got to be on the journey with her, which was so cool. But she worked her ass off. Can I say ass on your
Sure,
podcast?
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, no, she's incredible. And it's so cool just to see, to be a writer and then to walk alongside other writers and just have, like I was telling you before, just pure joy at their success and their experience. And there's no like weird writerly jealousy or FOMO or anything. You're just like, go, 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 go.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I mean, you yourself, you're such an accomplished novelist. You've won a Penn USA Award. You've written so many books. I've lost count. I think it's 12, maybe more if you count all the anthologies. But tell us a little bit about what you do as a writing coach, because I think a lot of people are familiar with freelance editors, but most people don't know what writing coaches are. And there's actually kind of a big difference.
There is a really big difference. And I do both, but coaching is my deep, deep love. And it's something that I don't know if it was really around like that many years ago. It just kind of started evolving, I think, as more writers were able to create online platforms and reach out to one another. I mean, there were always mentors, certainly, like, I've had professors in my MFA program who were mentors and things like that. But a writing coach is something that it's like, if you are a writer and that's something that's within your means to get, you should get one. Doesn't have to be me, but it's the thing like that I wanted and didn't have. And a writing coach is not a therapist, although some of them can also be therapists, but they kind of serve that sort of intermediary function between, a therapist and then let's say like your very best writing friend who totally gets, how hard it can be in the industry and your own personal quirks as a writer and struggles and challenges. And they're in the middle of that. So really able to offer mentorship, advice, create context for clarity, encouragement, accountability, and also to kind of normalize the experiences that people have. Like a lot of the writers that I work with are agented or already published or have been very successful. And usually writers come to me when they're like, I'm really stuck. And either it's like creatively stuck or it's somewhat creatively, but also just emotionally stuck. Like, where am I going with my life as a writer? Where do I find inspiration? This industry is getting me down, or comparisonitis, imposter syndrome, like all these things that come up. And I've had so many writers say, I try to talk to my therapist about it, but they don't get it. And most therapists don't get it because they're not all creatives. They haven't all been on that journey. And I know for myself, there's so many times when I like have been in therapy where I'm like trying to express my whatever I'm having with my creative process. And the therapist is just so curious about the writing world that it ends up just being me like explaining what it's like to be a writer. And I don't get help, So I feel like writing coaches a good writing coach, I should say, because there's a lot of people out there that will hang up their shingle and be like, I'm a writing coach. And I'm like, that's so interesting because you like never published a book. I don't understand how you can coach somebody through that process. But if they're a good writing coach, then they're going to be somebody that will really meet you where you're at and really help you. I guess for me, it's like helping writers to find deep satisfaction in the work, regardless of what happens. But not to be the kind of person that's like, oh, I don't need to be published. That doesn't matter. I just care about the writing. Like, it's totally okay to want to be published and to want to win a National Book Award and all of those things. But do you love it? Can you sustain the love for it? And that's where like the rubber meets the road for a lot of people.
Okay, so I have my own question, but also I have questions from our community. And what I like to do is that Creative Inspired Happy is not just a podcast, we're also an online community of writers. And I will ask ahead of time if people have questions. And so everyone was just so excited about having you on the show. So my first question I think is pretty relevant. It's from Jessica M. And she says, I'm wondering how I can find a writing coach and make sure they understand that I'm not looking for criticism. I don't want the person to feel like they are being cut at the knees. And I also think some people really don't know how to help a writer if they aren't reading their work and telling them what to fix. So maybe in response to Jessica's query and maybe you can give a little more specificity about like how you would help a writer who's saying like, hey, I don't need you to do line edits, but like I'm stuck or, rather than just saying, hey, you go get them, what do you do?
Yeah, I think like, and it's almost like with athletes, like I am obsessed with Olympians. I used to be a figure skater. I wanted to go to the Olympics. That's a whole other long story, but I'm obsessed. And so is my husband, and we're just like Olympian fiends. And one of the things I love is sports psychology. And there's so many parallels between like professional athletes, elite athletes and writers and creatives. It's it's all I'd say 95% of it is the head game. Like, I mean, we've all read books where we're like, this book isn't really that great, but of course it like goes on to do really, really well, right? So of course talent's important, craft's important, but the biggest hurdle for people is that head game. And so when somebody says to me like, I don't need lots of critique or whatever. And especially like, a lot of the writers I work with, like they've got great editors, like they're doing fine. Like they don't really need that from me. Some writers, they need to know what's not working, but not in like a critiquing kind of way, but kind of like, what are their tendencies that they like drop into on the page a lot? Are they rushing a lot or something like that? But with the actual coaching aspect, because that gets into a little bit more book coaching, like writing coaching is really getting curious. I get so curious about the writer, and I ask them, they do a big intake with me, and I ask them like, tell me about your lifestyle, tell me about your spirituality, how do you feel about money, what's your relationship to money, what's your process when you're doing something you love that's not writing, and then we get into their creative process. And it's like this really cool dialogue where we go like step by step by step by step. And then what do you do? Wait, what'd you do before that? What did you do after that? Oh, interesting. Do you always do that? So we really get into the nitty gritty, because I think for a lot of writers, especially, there's so many craft books out there, so many creativity books, so many, whatevers. And that's why I love what you do, Evelyn, because I feel like you just give people permission to play and to have so much joy. Like whenever I get your Substack, I'm like, oh, this is so fun. Like your recent one with the teddy bear, I'm like, this is delightful, and I feel like for writers, really having somebody say like, you have a process and you can be empowered in the writer's seat. And you don't need somebody to tell you what to do. You need to figure out what you do. Like, what are your strengths? And then actually believe in those strengths and amplify them. And I think for a lot of people, they're just like being told like, oh, you're going to do great if you do this thing. And it's like, well, maybe that worked for the person that wrote that book, but that might not work for you. And that's okay. So I think curiosity, like I would say if someone's looking for a writer's coach, have a clarity call with them. Hopefully they'll offer you something that's free for 30 minutes or something, but see if they're curious about you and asking you a lot of questions. If they're just talking about themselves, that's a big red flag.
Okay, and so what I'm hearing from you, there's kind of like two different kinds of coaching. There's like the writing coaching or the writer, I'm going to say writer coaching, and then there's
Hmm.
book coaching. And so
Yeah.
the book coaching, it's not quite editing. It's like you said, what are your tendencies? Maybe, you let's say I write 3 chapters and I send them to you and I say, okay, I feel like chapters 1 and 2 are great, but I don't know what's wrong with 3. And then you read it and you say, okay, because I know you, here's what you're doing in 3. And this is why it doesn't feel good to you. But then for the writer coaching, that may be at the same time as book coaching, but maybe also is earlier or later in the process, just depending on when the person needs it.
Yeah, and some people they'll do both, and some people will just do one or the other. Like somebody might just be like, I just want you to do a manuscript critique. And then that's basically editorial work, right? Of course, it's me, so then I'm still asking them about their process and things like that. And then the writing coaching, that might really be about like if someone's struggling with procrastination or whatever, we look at that. But I'll just give you an example, like and the reason why I like to look at my writer's work, even if I only see a few, like a chapter or two at the very beginning of our relationship, I just want to know like what's on the page for them and how they present. Um, but if there's a writer who I'll keep the example very vague, but I've worked with writers who struggle to um, go into depth during difficult scenes. And so, an editor might just say, hey, I'm not connecting emotionally to this moment. And I'll say, why are you holding back in this moment? What's going on here? Is there something here that you need to explore with your therapist that you're afraid to put on the page? And you don't have to put it on the page. Like you're not obligated to, but there's something happening that's blocking that, right? So that's where you get into that like gray area where, an ethical book coach, if they don't have a therapy background, would say like talk to your therapist about this. But a good book coach is going to go there with you. I have a lot of writers who are writing about trauma that has happened to them, and it might not be in the capacity of like a memoir. It might be like they're fictionalizing something, but they have had that traumatic thing happen. And again, an editor is going to be like, oh, I don't believe this scene or whatever, but the book coach is going to be like, how are you taking care of yourself while you're writing? What are you doing when you get dysregulated as you're writing? How can we work with that so that you don't become really depressed or start having nightmares while you're writing? And I think, again, being a writer myself who's worked in that area of exploring personal material, I can speak from experience. But then, as you know, I'm also doing, clinical social work. And so, like, that's coming into it as well. Um, and I think a lot of harm gets done to writers by book coaches or teachers or even editors who are not trauma informed. And so, it's especially for your listeners who are working in trauma, you have to have somebody who's trauma informed and has some experience with that, because there's so much harm that can be done to you or that you could do to yourself unwittingly. So,
No, I think that's fantastic advice. I mean, so much insight that I had never thought of that I don't think a lot of people think about when they're writing. And like you said, a lot of well-intentioned editors or agents, they're just not aware of it because all they're seeing is what's literally on the page and not necessarily connecting it with what's coming from you as a person. Whereas you as the writer's coach, you've kind of plumbed those depths, you know a little bit more about them. And so you might see that connection where others might not. So you
mm-hmm.
mentioned that you are getting your master's in social work. And I know that you mentioned that this was so that you'd be able to help creatives a little bit more with mental health, wellness practices, mindfulness. I would love to hear a little bit more about what you've learned so far, where you are in that practice, and how it's kind of, changed what you do as a writing coach.
Yeah, it's incredible. So the reason, as you mentioned, that I started this degree is because so many writers that I worked with did have trauma, did have diagnoses, depression, anxiety, what have you. Um, and I wanted to be able to better meet them where they're at, certainly do no harm. And so that's why I'm pursuing a clinical degree. So it is, therapy practice, and I'm halfway through. I actually have a field practicum at an arts high school. I feel like I work at Fame. All of the teenagers I work with are artists, and it's the most amazing place. And I think what's really important is being able to find that sweet spot where it's like, how is our work therapeutic? How does it create personal catharsis and transformation? And what I always tell people is, to write from the wound as best you can, taking care of yourself, and then edit from the scar. So the idea would be that by the end of your book, and you might start off a book and think, oh, I'm just writing a funny whatever. And then you're like, whoa, this thing came up in this scene and it's bringing things up for me. So the idea would be that by the end of, let's say the second draft or the third draft, you've really healed whatever it is that needed to be healed. And you've accessed your own inner wisdom and it's come through your book so that by the end of the book, you're writing from this place of like your wisdom mind. And then you put it out into the world and now it's medicine, And I speak from personal experience. That's happened to me. And I feel like that's one thing that a lot of therapists just like aren't able to do for writers because they don't know the creative process, and they might not know the parallels between some of the ways, like especially in social work we talk so much about systems, and we look at systems of oppression and on the micro, meso, and macro level. And so it's like, wow, like especially so many women right now are writing about gender-based violence, for example. And whether or not that has happened to them, they're talking about like how it feels when a man is walking behind you, like how their body reacts and how that contraction goes into other parts of their lives and shows up on the page and all these kinds of things. And so I just feel like, especially because of the work I do with the organization Rebecca Dykes Writers, and we're in collaboration with the Highlights Foundation, and we work with people who write for young people about trauma. And those retreats are super intense. And so I would not be able to support those writers without this clinical background that I'm getting. So I'm just really grateful for it.
No, I mean, it sounds like it's giving you such an additional perspective to something that you were already probably kind of honed into. I feel like your personality is like, it's very sensitive. I bet you have a very high emotional intelligence quotient, or EQ, whatever it was called. Actually, this leads me to another question from our community. Sylvia D asked, what are some health practices that you engage in that support your writing? And this might be for mental health, it might be for physical health.
I love this question so much because I feel like oftentimes writers will come into working with a coach and it's kind of like they want results and they're like, I want to publish this book, or I want to, be on the list, or whatever it is. And that's all wonderful. But they're not attending to their instrument, right? And so I often think about how what are the things dancers are doing to stay in shape, right? Or musicians, how they're practicing the violin for 8 hours a day or whatever it is. And writers, we don't really have practices that a lot of other arts have, right? To kind of like hone the muscle. And so for us, it really is about our mental health and that clarity. So one is definitely meditation. I'm a mindfulness facilitator. That's a huge, huge part of what I do. And it's frustrating because on the one hand, I'm really happy everyone's talking about meditation and mindfulness. And on the other hand, it's gotten, thrown into corporate America, capital, it's like capitalism and can I buy this and can I get my quick fix? And it really is like a slow but steady process of befriending your mind and understanding the contents of your mind and understanding your body. And so a big part of it is, attending to where in my body am I tensing up? So a health practice is like just noticing, oh, I'm really tense, and just softening. And I do that in the writer's seat, outside of the writer's seat, practicing, because I would say you're a writer 24/7. Huge. Second thing, therapy. All writers, all humans should have a therapist, which is privilege, of course. Not everyone can access that, but finding ways to get mental health support is huge because, like I said, 95% of, in my opinion, issues that creatives have is the inner critic, is the trauma, is all the stuff. We live in our heads. And then the third thing, and it's related to mindfulness, but it's really being a good steward of your attention. So Walt Whitman had written in a letter to somebody, dismiss whatever insults your own soul. And I recently read, there's a great Substack called The Laundry, and it's written by two of my mindfulness mentors. And one of them recently wrote a post about how in 2024, the word of the year for Oxford Dictionary was brain rot. And it's that feeling, we all know it, right? When you're scrolling and you kind of get that dopamine hit, and then you start to feel really slow and sluggish. And for us as writers, like, we have to be so careful about consuming media, consuming content, because if you're so full up in here, you can't get those dots to connect. I think it was Mihai Chick, how do you say his name? Csikszentmihalyi, the creativity guy. He talks about creativity as two different things becoming a new thing. But if your brain is full, how are those two different things ever going to find each other, right? So I think for writers, a huge part of our work is tending to the body and the mind, and being kind to ourselves too, because there's such a huge connection. And like, I have chronic pain, I have fibromyalgia, endometriosis, chronic migraine, blah blah blah. So being able to tell myself, like, oh, okay, today is not a writing day. Like, I don't feel good. I'm not going to push myself, and that's okay. And then on the days I do feel well, like, all right, let's do it. Let's have resilience and show up. And so it's just that constant tending, because, the world needs us. The world needs writers. They need our words. They need our stories. And if we don't take care of ourselves, they're not going to get it. So.
No, I love that. Love that so much. And you are just so good at these transitions because you're just lobbing, queuing me up for the next question from our community. Let's see. Sam S had a question which was about, writing our stories, right? And he says, do you have any tips for balancing between writing that is true to your heart, those stories that you want to tell, versus the quote unquote stories that sell?
Oh, such a good question.
Yeah. And then actually, I'm going to add to that because I think this
Yeah.
is kind of a similar question from Hope S, which is, do you recommend writing like a punchy book style or a lengthier story?
Ooh. So, my advice to this is always is write what lights you up. And that might be the thing that sells. The problem is, and I know you've talked about this before, like, we are not fortune tellers. And if there's a trend, if you're seeing a trend, it's by the time you submit something, like, that trend is over. And also, you never know what's going to hit. But the one thing editors and agents cannot say no to is a really great story. It doesn't matter if it's like, oh, do we need one more story about vampires or whatever it is, right? It's like, and I notice this even doing all the editorial work I do. And I used to be a publishing intern, and you just know right away, especially when you get used to like seeing pitches all the time, and you see when the work sings, you see in the first few sentences if somebody's heart and soul is in something, and they're writing from that place of being lit up and yes and excited about the book. And when it's clear that someone's trying to write something to sell, it just doesn't have that je ne sais quoi. It doesn't have that fizz that makes somebody go, ooh, I want to read this. Mm-hmm. So I always just tell people, like, even if all signs are saying like, oh, we don't need another book like this, if you're excited about it, write it. And I have a good friend who, she's been working on this time travel novel for like a million years. It's going to be fabulous whenever it gets published. And when she gets stuck on it, or when she, worries about like, is this ever going to even sell? It's so like weird or whatever. She's a very quirky writer. She just works on something else, and she just finished a middle grade, and now that's on sub. And then she's like, okay, back to the time travel novel. So that can happen too. I always say you can cheat on your book. Like, don't cheat on your partner, but you can cheat on your book.
I love that. I love that. And actually, a kind of another example of something of what you've just said is I wrote an entire YA manuscript years ago, and my agent sent it on submission, and no one wanted it, and I was sad. But one of the editors that we submitted to was at Disney, and she actually came back to us and said, hey, this manuscript is not for me, but we would love someone to write a new Disney princess for us, and Evelyn's voice has that kind of quality that we're looking for, so would she be interested? So a lot of times these kinds of projects, usually you have to audition for them, you're competing against a lot of other writers, but I didn't have to, because I just happened to send something in that I wrote that was something that I truly loved, right? So my voice like shone through, and even though that wasn't the right one for them, it was something else, right? So I ended up writing two books for
Yeah.
them. So I love when that kind of like the magic of the universe kind of comes together. And it's like you said, it's because you're being you as a writer.
Yes. And it's just like, we need, I always forget this quote and it's on my email. But it's like, oh God, wait, let me see if I'm going to look at my email and tell you what this quote is because I always forget it. Um, so it's Howard Thurman, and he says, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it because the world needs people who have come alive." I love that quote so much because it's like, are you alive? Are you here for this one wild, precious life? And like, you only get so many books. I'm always telling this to writers. I'm like, I'm a Zen Buddhist. We talk about death all the time. We're cool with that. And I'm always like, look, you don't know when you're going to die. So are you okay if this is your last book? Like, is that what you want to spend your life writing? And if you do, awesome. And if you're like, no, I was just doing the calculus of publishing, then it's like, don't write that book, because it's going to bring you misery and, it'll take forever and then it won't sell and it'll be just a disappointment. Just do what makes you come alive.
I love that. Okay. So this question is from Sam R. And it's interesting because it kind of it's the controversial AI question. And it's, it's like we're human and yet AI, I feel, has changed a lot in the last couple years since ChatGPT came out. Some people are becoming better at using it as a tool. So Sam's question is, I'm curious if generative AI, Gen AI, has changed any of your guidance to writers, especially as it might relate to co-writing, outlining, or brainstorming and exploration.
Mm. I always appreciate when somebody asks that question because I am not neutral at all about it. I am just completely against AI. And I know that some people aren't. And I've had writers, when I was professoring, I've taken a break from that, but I was an adjunct MFA professor for a long time. And I had students who were like, this really helps me outline, or this really helps me brainstorm. And, especially for folks who are neurodivergent, that can be really supportive. It can be creating opportunities for accessibility. For me, of course, I'm one of those people that's like, oh, the snowball effect makes me really nervous. And I also just feel like I want people to trust their own imaginations and capabilities. And I would much rather see them be in community with other writers and work on that outline with a friend, right? Like work on that outline in community. And again, is that a privileged viewpoint? Like not everybody has that. Not everybody has access to writing friends. Some people are writing in secret. They're writing about topics that aren't safe for them to talk to other people about, depending on where they live and what they're writing about. So I totally get, especially from the like social justice accessibility end of things, why people are open to AI. I'm just one of the people that's just like, I just don't see this going anywhere good for us as creatives. But that's just me, and
Oh,
no judgment.
yeah, no, I love that. I appreciate you sharing that opinion. It's actually kind of brave to go out and say something about it because I know it can be a little bit of a sensitive subject.
Yeah, and that's why I always try to mention, like, I get it from the accessibility and social justice side because I think it's really easy for certain people to say, like, well, I feel this way, and you should just go find somebody, and you should just go do that. And it's like not everybody has that access. And so I think it's just really important for people to get curious and ask themselves, why am I doing this? And if there is a reason that feels like, because of how their mind works or accessibility, okay. But if when they really enter into that inquiry, it's like, oh, I think I just like am afraid to outline. And it's like, oh, then meet that fear. Don't bypass it and just have the robot do it for you. Like, because that's going to make you a better writer and a stronger writer. So
Okay, well, that's perfect for our next question from Tammy, which was, how do you get over yourself and that fear or that self-doubt of not knowing how to begin, like when you're afraid that you're just gonna make a mess and you're only just starting?
yeah, I hear that question like hard because I am one of those people that adores revision and hates the blank page. When I see the blank page, like I'm starting a new book like next week, totally new book. I mean, like, I have the premise. I don't even know what the plot is. It's super, super new. And it's a fantasy. I don't know the magic system, whatever. And I'm just like that, oh God, the blank. It's like existential for me, you know? So I get it. And I love how that question started with, how do you get over yourself? Because I think that's where the answer is. It's getting over yourself, right? And meditation is, for me, how I do that. And what I do is, rather than focusing on myself, I focus on, what do I want to put out into the world? Who in the world do I think will need this book as medicine, as comfort, as strength, as inspiration? And so whenever a writer tells me that, I always say, okay, before we do anything, have you written your writer's artist statement? And usually they say no. And so what we do is, you know, when you go to a museum and they have like the artist statement on the wall before an exhibit, basically that's what I have them do. So why do you write? Who do you write for? What's the point of writing for you? And it's usually a really big moment for a writer, because it's so empowering to be like, I have a voice and this is what I want to say. This is who I care about. This is what I want to put out into the world. And as soon as you start looking not at yourself, but outward, not at critics, agents, editors, not that kind of like, oh, love me, but more like, who do I want to serve? And coming from a place of service, it's so much easier to not be afraid. Like, you think of the stories of the moms who lift the car because the baby's underneath or whatever. It's that same thing. When it's not about you, you find so much strength and capacity and resilience. But as soon as it's about you, all of the imposter syndrome and inner critic and all of that stuff comes in. So definitely writing a writer's artist statement is key. And I learned this kind of the hard way, because I remember, I think it was my debut year. This is like a really tough year because I had two books come out that year. I had a contemporary come out in the winter, and then the first of a fantasy series come out in the fall. And I, moved to New York City, and it was just like all new, and it was really intense. And I never got a break, which is like, the double-edged sword. Like, what an amazing opportunity, but also really hard on mental health for a writer. And I was on this panel, and I had my first ever panic attack. And the way it showed up was my mouth got really dry. And then my hands started to shake. So I couldn't drink water, because when I went to reach for the water, my hand was shaking. And it was just like, I started meditating after this, by the way. I was like, I need to change something, because it had built up in me. And so I was like, oh my God, how am I ever going to be on another panel again? And this was, the next panel that I was on was with like some really, really famous authors. And I was like, oh my God, this is a nightmare. I'm going to be such, I'm going to have another panic attack. And then I just stopped, and I was at the event at the bookstore, and I looked around, and in my mind, I was like, who needs to hear what I have to say today about women and about gender-based violence and about why I wrote this book and what inspired me and what I hope readers will take away from it. And even telling you this story, as I am saying this, I felt my whole system just relax into purpose. Like, this is why I'm here. Somebody needs to hear this. And it was the best panel I've ever been on. It was great. We were having an amazing conversation, and I was just like, yep, because it wasn't about me at all.
I love that. I love that so much. It's so helpful, especially because I'm in the middle of writing a new book as well. And I'm a little bit stuck. Like, sometimes I get to a chapter and I look at my outline and think, gosh, this is so boring. What is the point of writing this book even, And I think that redirect to what is the bigger purpose is very, very helpful. And so you might have already sort of answered this, but Gail has a question, and she says, do you recommend any particular writing routines, like for craft, mental routines? I know you've talked about meditation, for getting a first draft over the line, because sometimes it's really hard to stay motivated during this is hard part, like what I was just saying, the boring chapters, or that I'm not really sure where this is going.
Yeah, and this is kind of like my bread and butter as a writer, because like I said, like I really don't like first drafts, because I love fixing things, but like making something up at first is just like, oh, come on. So I have this thing that it kind of started because I was working with writers on their process, and I'd be like, oh, what's your process? And they would say, I don't have a process, or I have no idea. And so I kind of, over many conversations with many different writers, broke down process into these different phases. And so on my website, I have this whole thing called You Have a Process. And so the first part is I call it courting flow. And so when you're drafting, it can, yeah, you can get into that place where you're just like, oh God, here we go again. I've got nothing, what's this book even about? So you have to court flow, kind of like a lover. Like flow's not just going to come, like you have to entice it. So for me, it's listening to music that puts me in the mood for the scene I'm going to write. So if it's a really intense scene, I will listen to really intense music and I'll just sit there and I'll close my eyes and I'll just dream the scene like it's a movie. And as soon as I start to feel that fizzy, like, ooh, I want to write feeling, I start writing. For some writers, they go for a run first, or they collage, or they dance, or they light candles. Like there's some way that they're like, come on, Flo, come hang out with me. And then the next part is so key. I call it orient. And writers never know this, and this is so exciting. I love seeing them discover this. I always say, when you start writing, how do you orient on the page? Like, how do you find your bearings? Like you've been dropped in, parachuted in, you're a World War II spy in France, dropped in. How do you know where you are? And it's so cool because some writers are like, I don't know. And then we go and we look at their first few chapters and they're like, oh, I always orient with dialogue, or it's always setting, or it's always an image, or it's always a scent, or, I mean, every writer is different. And so when you get stuck and you're like, oh God, what do I do? Okay, wait, I have to court flow. Okay, now I want to write. Oh God, it's the blank page. Wait, how do I orient? Okay, dialogue. What do my characters have to say today? And you start going. And so the more you get to know your process, the more you can kind of own all of those stages we get into. So you get stuck. If you've worked on this, like, okay, what's my process when I get stuck? Oh, what really helps me is journaling as my character, or doing a collage of the scene, looking at images in books, whatever it is. And so then you get unstuck and then you move on. So really seeing it as a process as opposed to like, oh dear God, what's next?
Yeah, that is so helpful. I feel like I'm learning so much from this conversation. Thank
Yay!
you for starting out my new year, right?
That was
Okay,
my evil plan all along.
I have one more question for you from the community, and then I have one from myself. So Jessica M wants to know, how can a writer juggle writing, parenting, and a full-time job? Because any insight would be much, much appreciated. And I know for you, you're juggling so many things too. You're writing your own books, you're doing your master's in social work, you're a coach. Help us.
Yeah, I mean, what I love is how committed writers are to their work. They've got so much on, and then they're like, I still want to write. I still want to keep this part of myself alive. And so I think always just reminding yourself that you are a writer 24/7. So even if it's a non-writing day, like you were going to go and write when you got home, but then your kid is sick, or the baby had a blowout, or whatever it is, it's like, okay, I'm still a writer. And so it's really about, again, like that tending to your attention. So especially when you're a parent, especially when you're working full time, you're so tired. Your brain is like, your bandwidth is so full. You have so many tabs open. And so really being able to find those pockets of time. And even if those pockets of time aren't actually spent physically writing, but maybe they're spent reading some poetry, or listening to music that just like makes you feel your book, and you just sit there and your eyes are closed and you're just dreaming up scenes. Having a little notebook and you read a great quote, or you have an idea and you write it down, even having that physical notebook on your body. So yes, you can put notes in your phone, right? But you open your phone and suddenly it's like, oh, text, I missed this call. Here's this app. Should I check Instagram? So I always tell people, like Anne Lamott talks about in Bird by Bird that she always had note cards, like index cards that she kept with her. But I just love a little notebook, and then you just feel like a writer. So anything that makes you feel like a writer, and also as often as you can, name yourself as a writer. When people ask, what do you do? I'm a writer. And I'm also a mom, and I'm the CEO of whatever. So it's just like really putting writing in the forefront, owning it, not being afraid to name it as who you are. And don't worry if you're not published. That's totally fine. I'll just share my personal pet peeve when I say I'm a writer and someone says, I don't know why they only do this to writers. Oh, have I heard of you?
Yes.
Oh
It's
my
the
God.
worst. The
It's
worst.
the worst. And so it's like, even if you're not published, you're going to have that same feeling. Because as a published writer, when someone's like, have I heard of you? That's just like a really like, I don't even know how to respond to that. Right. And it's like, well, oh, yes, I'm actually Stephen King and I'm, in drag today. It's like, come on. So don't worry about if you're published or not. And then also just as often as you can, tending to that attention, recognizing like if you're driving home from work and no one else is in the car, maybe drive in silence and just see what it's like to give your mind that break, giving yourself as much of an opportunity to cultivate that field of creativity within you and not just move toward I'm so tired, I'm just going to scroll on my phone. Because when you're a parent, I totally get it. Like you're so tired. And so it's a practice. Like you have a writing practice and whether or not you're writing. And that's just keep that close and know even if you wrote one sentence in a whole month, you're still a writer because it's seasonal. We all go through seasons where we're, writing a lot, when we're writing less, it's okay.
And speaking of seasons, this gets me to my question for you, which is
Ah,
beginning of the year, a lot of people are saying, you know what, this is the year that I'm
mm,
finally going to write the book that I've been dreaming of. I've always wanted to write a book, but it's just a dream at this point. They don't really know how to get started. What's your advice for them for this entire year, maybe, or even the first month,
mm.
whatever your best advice is for someone who's just like, this is what I want this year.
Yeah, I love New Year is like, this time of year, like January, there's just so much energy. I love New Year's. I just love it. I love getting my new planner and all of that kind of stuff. And I think being able to sit in that desire to really create something and to have this be the year where you stop making excuses and where you keep putting your desire on the back burner and putting everybody else before you, all of that kind of stuff. I think distilling it into a word, like a lot of people like to do like their word for the year. And I think that's really helpful because what's painful for me to see is when a writer, in January is like, I'm writing my book this year, but then somebody gets a cancer diagnosis or they get laid off of their job or something happens. And then they internalize this shame of like, this was going to be my year and I failed. And so, what I always suggest to people is how do you want to show up for your writing this year and have that be your goal? So, let's say you do want to have this be the year that you write. How do you want to show up? What does that look like? And then can you distill it into a phrase or a word and have that be like a talisman for you for the year? So, like last year, my word was strength. And so that would show up in different ways. Like, I don't have as much time to write right now because I'm in grad school. So, what does strength as a writer look like? You know, and how am I showing up for my writing practice with that sense of strength and dignity? And then I already have my word for this year, 2025, and it is courage. And it just like came to me in October. Like that was my desire. I was like, I want to have courage. And so this year, my goal is to really show up with um, fearlessness and not thinking about market and just saying like, what does courage as a writer look like? And maybe courage looks like, I really want to write today, but I don't feel well. So how can I show up for my writing with courage without writing? Or maybe it looks like, oh, I really want to write this weird thing, but it's so weird, it's not going to sell, but maybe I write it anyway. And again, your desire for whatever your writing is, if you want to write your book this year, it can be embedded in that, but it also offers a little bit of grace, right? An understanding of like, we don't know what's going to happen and how. So it's really about how you're showing up rather than what you're producing. So it's not having that capitalist, like efficient, I'm a machine, here's the product I will produce this year. But it's like, how am I going to be in the world and live in the world as a writer, as a creative, and see what that opens up for you.
Oh, what a beautiful, beautiful feeling to go into this year with. I just want to wrap with, where can people find you if they want to know more about your books or if they want to reach out to you as a writing coach?
Yeah, so heatherdemetrios.com. And I know people are always looking at your stuff on Substack. So I'm on Substack. You could just type in Heather Demetrios or Lotus and Pen. The Lotus and Pen is my Substack. And yeah, I'm always writing about writing and process and life and mental health for writers. And yeah, so yeah, come find me if you have questions, if you're looking for a little bit of support. And like the last thing I just want to say is just like, for writers, is this is a tough year for a lot of people. So just trust that your story matters and that your words matter and that you matter and that somebody needs to hear what you have to say. Like somebody needs what you have to say. And you've been given this talent and this desire and this calling. Don't be afraid to answer that. That's really important to remember because it can be hard out there, you know?
I love that. Thank you so much, Heather. I cannot wait for your next book. Good luck with this fantasy that you're just starting on.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be a great and courageous year for you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Want more writing advice and career insight? Join thousands for free at creativeinspiredhappy.com to go behind the scenes with best-selling authors and get access to our book club for writers, creativity challenges, and more. I can't wait to see you there.